here for a little bit and talk about Marvel's Thunderbolts asterisk movie. So I highly recommend it. Spoiler. And I'm going to explain why. Because I think it's a great movie with a beginning, middle, and end that demonstrates the authenticity of imperfect people coming together for a goal greater than themselves. And I think it's actually more powerful than something like the Avengers. So I have a colleague of mine who really likes to talk about Greek mythology and how people embody different instincts, like the Zeus, Ares, Apollo instincts, and that's awesome. So it'll be interesting to get his thoughts on this, but my thoughts are complicated heroes serve as a way for people to understand their own kind of role in the social ecosystem, for people to understand how to move through and deal with trauma. And that no matter what you've been through, having a rocky background, right, you can come out and learn and implement some skills to get through and actually develop a new identity. And so I think the Thunderbolts movie is all about developing new identity in the face of great adversity. So just giving my thoughts on it. One thing you need to keep in mind is you don't actually have to understand a lot about the previous movies that this team is in. Yelena Belova is arguably the heart of the film. So she actually comes from the Black Widow movie and is the sister of the Scarlett Johansson Black Widow character. You don't really have to know that. She's also the daughter of this character, Alexei Shostakov. So again, you do need to know that relationship, and it's introduced to you in the movie. So you don't really need much going into it except a passing knowledge of Marvel and the fact that the Avengers movies happened, right? And that those were the real superheroes who made good decisions, except kind of arguably Iron Man, right? He was this billionaire playboy archetype. Right. But most of them, like the original Captain America, Steve Rogers, had a really good track record and were pretty sterling examples of superheroes. And so you could kind of say that that's a sort of idealism of the mid 20th century. And so that's what the original Avengers represented, which I think is interesting. So we can kind of get into that and how Thunderbolts, which by the way, that's not really the real name of the movie. It's the one with an asterisk on it on the signs. And there's a reason why that isn't really revealed. And the true title of the movie is revealed at the end of it, which I find pretty interesting. So I'm going to say that's probably something to check out. And I'll talk about at the end here. So I'm going to keep a little bit of suspense going here. But in my therapeutic review of Thunderbolts, I'm just going through the plot. Essentially, these characters show up in a room together that becomes kind of the bottle in which they all have to meet one another. So Yelena Belova, who again is from Black Widow, she's a trained assassin whose childhood was basically stolen to turn her into an assassin, right? And she has intrusive flashbacks of having to harm another child. Okay. She is in the midst of working for a CIA director using her violent skills and her hypervigilant nervous system in a state sanctioned way. And we find her, we find that she and some others have been directed to a one facility, and they're actually supposed to off each other. So the whole goal is that they all show up here, take care of each other, to tie up the loose ends of a CIA director who's been doing some stuff on the side, who's been dabbling in creating superhumans and doesn't want that found out because she's being impeached. So that's a big part. And so these characters, John Walker is included, who is the disgraced Captain America who unalived someone. He fatally wounded someone, and so that mantle was taken from him. So John Walker is there. Someone named Ava Starr is there who has this phasing ability, and she is from. So her character's named Ghost, and she's from some Ant-Man movies. And so again, that's not. So she was an Ant-Man and the Wasp, and she was in Thunderbolt. So here's the deal: you don't really have to know much about her except that she can phase through walls, she wisecracks, whatever. So she's there in this building. So is John Walker, and so is Taskmaster. And so they're all there fighting each other and stop to talk and figure out, wait a minute, we've all been sent by the same CIA director, Valentina Fontaine. Okay, mystery. ensues, right? The plot thickens. And so someone in a literal pod comes out who introduces himself as Bob. And so this is the context of the movie. It starts out really strong, okay? And you follow Yelena's dialogue. And so it's very interesting because she starts out, again, the heart of the movie. She is in a lab at the very beginning of the film saying that she has emptiness her and a void, that she's bored. She gets sent on jobs for the CIA director and she throws herself into her work, but it's not the answer. She doesn't feel focused. Okay, she doesn't feel like she has purpose. So she's saying that to someone that the camera pans out, and she's actually talking to someone that she's tied up and put a piece of tape over. So this is a little bit edgier than your typical Marvel fare. So she's a hired assassin in this gray area because she's working for the CIA, but then the CIA director who hired her is doing some really shady stuff that isn't being brought to light, and she's trying to actually unalive. She's trying to terminate Yelena. By then, after Yelena takes care of this lab and blows it up, Yelena then gets sent to this building where she's trapped with other people who all were hired by the CIA director who is being impeached. That's the context of the movie. You don't have to know much besides that these characters are all in some way wanted for their skills, okay? And they all have come an edge to them and they don't hesitate to attack others, okay? Not superheroes, in other words. So that's the first real departure in this film, right? Okay. And so to go back to where we were, characters in this building. Bob comes out of the pod. We don't really know much about him apart from he tries to help the characters and seems pretty altruistic. Doesn't remember what happened to him. He was in a pod. He was from a study that occurred. The CIA director Valentina was directing, and so throughout the movie, so the characters escape. Our anti-heroes, you could call them, escape from this facility, right? Okay. And Bob goes out and distracts because so Valentina finds out that the anti heroes actually talk and work together and don't blow each other up. Oh, okay. That's a big deal. All right. So she dispatches a team to go take care of them manually because the building was supposed to incinerate and have all those people in there, all our anti hero team, the Thunderbolts, in other words. And it doesn't happen because they escape because Ava Star or Ghost helps to get them out. They climb up an escape shaft by banding together and being on each other's backs as they climb up, and they have to kind of link arms, climb up together. So they're bickering and they fight and they're uneasy allies, but they do manage to work together. But they're still trapped in the building because a military team comes to take care of them. So led by Valentina, played by Julia Louis-Dreyfus, pretty good role. She's kind of snarky. So, okay. So Bob, who has been rescued and is the new character we don't know, with the team and helps them to band together. He's kind of that voice of togetherness. Well, he manages to be completely bulletproof and stand out and get shot at by the military and then fly up into the sky uncontrollably, crash back to Earth, and provides a distraction for the other characters to leave, who reluctantly leave. They try to get him, but they leave. So then the movie gets into a little bit of a travel film, a little bit of a buddy jaunt where people are driving around. And what's very interesting about this is the uh, Bob. So Bob was I'm going to spoil it here, and Matt, and obviously goes without saying spoilers for a therapist review of a movie. So Bob is essentially this voice of conscience for these anti-heroes, right? They're all somewhat narcissistic and self-absorbed, and they all have interesting backstories. And so when it comes to Yelena, she is this grizzled assassin who is directionless and is just doing work to kind of keep her nervous system active and keep her mind active off of doing anything personal related, right? So she's going through the motions, and she visits her father, Alexei, who is played brilliantly by the wonderful actor. And here's where I'm going to have to do some editing, by David Harbour, okay? And he is her father. So she goes to visit him, and he's not really doing anything but running a limo business. And so he's having this kind of middle-aged, midlife crisis. And I think that's interesting for a Marvel movie. So I think the closest we got to that before would be Iron Man dealing with his desire to settle down with Pepper Potts, who he obviously does and has a daughter. And he goes from being the fun, lighthearted, quipping Spider-Man on steroids sort of figure who is the genius inventor and also womanizer, who kind of has maxed out his charisma, whereas Spider-Man maxes out his heart in most Marvel movies, even though he's got the charisma. So I think we've got like kind of Iron Man 3 is a really good previous example of this sort of movie where the middle-aged midlife crisis is explored. Of I think it's time. I mean, Iron Man 2 as well, but basically you don't have a lot of portrayals of a midlife crisis in Marvel movies. It's just not there. So for David Harbour's character to have that, I think is pretty interesting. And I think one of the big elements of this movie that's fascinating is the characters don't have any reason to trust each other at the beginning. When they're in this bottle, or there's something on TV called a bottle episode, is where everything happens in one room. So we get a taste of something like that in the initial interactions in that compound where the anti-heroes are trapped together and have to work together to live. And so if you look at something like the Avengers movies and take your pick, there's quite a few of them. Obviously, the first one, if you look at that, you'll see that the heroes meet each other and they're wary, but they're all playing for the same team and they know they eventually they build that rapport. So Thunderbolt says we're going to portray real people in a prisoner's dilemma type situation. So prisoner's dilemma is a game theory situation where you ultimately get the least amount of punishment if you band together, but you don't actually know if the other person is going to choose that. So if one person defects and confesses to a crime and the other doesn't, you get a lesser sentence. If both people confess, you don't really get much of a benefit. If neither confesses, you get the ultimate benefit. Okay? So for example, let's run through it together. If both prisoners confess, they receive a 2-year sentence. If one confesses and the other doesn't, then the confessor goes free and the other person receives a 3-year sentence. Okay. Now, if both prisoners stay silent, they both get 1 year. So that works out well for both. Okay. And so both are going to probably be incentivized to confess, or unless they know that the other one, that they know that the other person is trustworthy and won't confess, and they both stay silent. Okay. That's the prisoner's dilemma. And so John Nash and Nash equilibrium is stuff to consider when we talk about that. But suffice to say, for our purposes, this when you look at the Thunderbolts, they all have to work together in a huge sense to come out. Like they could go their own way, but they reach a point where they realize that they're not going to make it, so they have to. So you could argue. So if you look at the Thunderbolts as an example of the prisoner's dilemma, they were all previously incentivized to be against each other. And then when they find themselves in this building and they have to work together, there's an incentivization there. There's an incentive to actually band together because they could go on their own and try to survive, and they have a lesser chance of survival. If they band together, then they have a higher chance. So that's a first sea change there that happens for these previously selfish characters to see that working together can be an answer. Okay. Then they end up trying to go rescue Bob, and they uh, are found by Bucky Barnes, okay, who is now in Congress in some capacity. So I'm going to condense quite a bit in this movie. So Bob, the character who can fly and is bulletproof, is actually taken to the Avengers Tower, which now is called the Watchtower, by the CIA director. So there's something very postmodern about this film, which is very interesting because postmodernism as a movement where we don't really have any guiding narratives and meta narratives, or the narratives that hold other narratives, are basically all fluid and debatable. Okay, it kind of relates to the death of God as spoken of by Nietzsche. So in society now, there's a large level of relativisms. Basically, in the Avengers, that's not really the case. So the idea of truth, justice, and the American way is really big in the Avengers movies. That's a governing narrative, and so there's almost like this golden age comic feel to previous Marvel movies within that arc, within that universe. Even though there's some edgy stuff with Iron Man thrown in, some jokes here and there. With Steve Rogers as Captain America, the sort of sterling World War II veteran hero, it was always going to be a bit more on the modernist. There are truths, there are guiding principles. And so what I found interesting in Thunderbolts was that there was signposting, there was clear indication that the Avengers are gone. Their tower has now been taken over by a marketer, by someone who was very focused on appearances. So Valentina's character, the CI director, is extremely emphatic about showing best appearances, denying that she had been working on creating super soldiers, which she had been, emphatically denying it. She has a right hand woman who helps her to negate things and who, behind the scenes, in kind of a B plot, Bucky is trying to work with to reveal things, and she ends up helping the Thunderbolts. But so essentially, the Thunderbolts together are trying to get to the bottom of what's going on with Bob and go find him. And what's interesting about that is, so Bucky Barnes is kind of this connection from the OG original Avengers team, right? And the Thunderbolts. So the Thunderbolts are just trying to figure out, after they've been almost assassinated, they're trying to get to the truth because they realize their boss, Valentina, who had employed all of them in some capacity, was trying to off all of them. And so it becomes a road trip movie. And I think it's important to focus on how, so Yelena is this disgraced assassin, right? And we've got John Walker, who's involved, who is the disgraced Captain America, who attempted to be Captain America, essentially murders someone, loses the mantle, and goes to Sam Wilson. Okay. Yelena has PTSD symptoms. Walker is shown having perseveration on his past and on being disgraced and being other than honorably discharged from the military. So that's a big deal. We don't, with Ghost, I don't know as much her story. I didn't see the Ant-Man movies. And then Taskmaster, I don't really know as much about her. Well, I know there's trauma involved there. I know that that's from the Black Widow movies. But basically, and then Bob's trauma as he signed up for this military program to try to get a better life and is experimented on by Valentina in this shadowy governmental program to create super soldiers. And he's the result of that, right? So Bucky finds the group, and it's joked by Alexei, Yelena's father, that they should be called the Thunderbolts. And that's the name of Yelena's Pee Wee soccer team from her childhood. So that becomes a running joke. Alexei says they're the Thunderbolts. Okay. Spoiler, that's not what they go with. That's the name of the movie. It's a placeholder name. I'm still going to wait till the end to tell you what the real name of the movie is. And you might already know it if you've seen it. But basically, Bucky comes in, finds the group traveling in pursuit of justice, and initially is going to take them in, apprehend them, but he discovers what's going on with Valentina because he's been tracking her on his own. So Bucky is a congressman now. So he finds the group, he tries to determine what's going on, and when he's told by the group of Thunderbolts, if you will, that Bob was a subject of top secret experiments, then Bucky joins them. It becomes a real kind of buddy cop movie. And so it becomes very interesting when, up until now, there's no villain really except Valentina, who's kind of a government stiff and a bureaucrat, a psychopathic bureaucrat who will do anything to exploit, right? So what's interesting to me is it's a typical setup of, you've got people with their own self-interest at play, and then you have a psychopathic super manipulator who has exploited all of them. And I think this is actually a pretty common theme throughout a lot of media, is it's not really a hero and villain. And so this is also what's interesting and what's different about the Avengers versus the Thunderbolts, is with superhero media, traditionally, you have a clear force of evil and you have a clear force of good. And so you had the Avengers. You had, like, well, Captain America was good. Well, why was he good? Because he wanted to join the military and fight the Nazis in World War II. Okay. Enough said, right? Well, why was Spider-Man good? Well, because he failed to stop the person who eventually wounded his uncle, and he learned forever that actions have consequences in this sort of bizarre butterfly effect, almost OCD obsession with then preventing crime, because if he had have done it the one time he didn't, he wouldn't have lost his uncle. And you could really go into the motivation there, which I think I should at another time. But you have in the Thunderbolts, it's like, well, the heroes are let's call them protagonists. Protagonists are trying to do something. And it's okay, well, why? Well, because they were trying to make a living and patch some meaning together. And a lot of them have been through stuff. And someone got in the way and tried to end their lives. Like, oh, okay, well, so that's interesting. That's a very grounded motivation, as opposed to, we're going to save the world. It's like, okay, well, so now it's a smaller scale in Thunderbolts, but it's more relatable. And the heroes are very flawed. They're protagonists. They're not really heroes until the end. And I'll get into that. But essentially, they're trying to figure out what's going on in this kind of detective fashion. Like, why are they being were they being hunted and attempted to be completely obliterated, incinerated at this government facility? Okay. So then when Bucky teams up with him, he lends a sort of legitimacy to the film because, he's a hero, the Winter Soldier. He went through his dark night of the soul and he got brainwashed. But so it gets very interesting when Bucky and the group make it to the Watchtower where the Avengers used to convene. It's been taken over by this government stiff, this utterly psychopathic manipulator, Valentina Fontaine, who has now turned Bob into the Sentry. And so the Sentry has dyed blonde hair. It's very similar to the character in The Boys of Homelander. He's very similar to Homelander. So he's supposed to be this embodiment of American exceptionalism, basically the Marvel version of Superman. Of course, they can't use that term. And so he represents this sort of shimmering hero who's too good to be true and this sort of Christ figure. So it's very interesting to me because that's also what The Boys does. There's a lot of like evil Superman media to show like he's not that good. So they even have their shot at it with Thunderbolts, where there's this character who is a shiny, tight wearing, modernist, basically non-jaded hero who's going to be the embodiment, the collective projection of a Christ-like figure who saves humanity. Well, so spoiler, what ends up happening, Bob is so riddled with insecurity and past trauma and flashbacks, and it turns out his father is very abusive and would beat his mother, and when Bob would try to step in, the father would beat him and the mother would blame him for the father continuing the abuse. Very, very dark, which again is very interesting for a non-Deadpool, non-Blade Marvel movie, because those have all gone kind of a sunny route. But in Thunderbolts, no. Bob is this character who is extremely polite and demure, but turns out to be riddled with early childhood trauma. And so you've got early childhood trauma plus extreme superpowers for this cocktail of basically a child who, like a bull in a china shop, like a child with a shotgun, who is and he's being bullied by this psychopathic governmental character, Valentina. Like, you're going to be my project. You need to have your hair dye this color. You need to do this, you do that. You listen to me, me. I'm the only person who cares about you. And so Bob hears this, and it's shown that she's really manipulating him and turning the screws. And he just snaps. He says, I don't have to listen to you. If I have this kind of power, why do I need you as a master? And so what a tale as old as time that is, because that's basically the Frankenstein story of the monsters created who rebels and leaves. So Bob becomes this darkened hero named, according to Wikipedia, the Void, which is very interesting because that's his alter ego. And Yelena had said earlier, like, she felt this void, right, in her life. She had this malaise, this sense of existential ennui, existential angst, and just yawning sense of nothingness. Okay, fascinating. Well, so now the villain of this movie is this sense of existential emptiness and nothingness. And so I think for our era of post 2020, this is a very relevant villain. So before we had Thanos, we had Loki, we had sort of the big bads who represented this external threat. And I think that's a very modernist way of looking at superhero movies. And when you instead read them as this sort of exploration of the psyche, then having a villain who's basically a part of another character makes a ton of sense. So essentially, you have Bob becoming void, right? His inner darkness, his inner sort of nihilism. So nihilism becomes the villain. So far we have narcissism in the form of characters who care about nothing but themselves, right? And making a buck. And then you have psychopathy in the form of a government official who's pulling the strings, who wants the most glory possible and is willing to take on any persona, willing to do anything, willing to lie to people, use them, execute them even if they no longer suit her. And then you have now more villains. It's like you're going one step up in the evil arc from narcissism to psychopathy to ultimate nothingness. And so Bob represents that. He says, okay, I don't need anyone to pull my strings, and nothing matters at all, actually. All of this jockeying, it's all nothing, it's all empty. So almost a very biblical Shakespearean perspective, and like the book of Ecclesiastes, all is air, all is vapor. And I think it's very interesting that in the movie, Bob, as first Sentry, the superhero, then Void, the absolute opposite, he starts disappearing people and they turn into black mist or vapor, which is very much like the book of Ecclesiastes. Everything is a vapor, it's nothing. And so what spurred me to write and now talk about this on Substack is something that happens in the movie. One of the monologues, I think, is one of the most powerful monologues in cinema history for Marvel. And I think that's saying a lot. So I'm going to read it, and I'll probably edit this part out. So stick with me. This is a really good moment here. Okay, so Yelena says, I'm so alone. I don't have anything anymore. All I do is sit and look at my phone and think of all the terrible things I've done. And then I go to work and then I drink, come home to no one. Then I sit and think of all the terrible things I've done again and again. Okay, so that's massive. So why do I think that? Okay, why am I interested in this monologue? So I think that this is a stand-in for the experience of the viewer. So I think that today's viewers of Marvel movies actually probably relate to that quite a bit. So here's the big mic drop. So in 2012, because I checked, when the first Avengers movie was made, Tinder had just been released, the app, the dating app. So you were in version one of Tinder. It was a pre-COVID era. It was sort of the 4-year, let's say, mark of smartphone era. Okay. So you had a sort of glimmering hopefulness to digital culture. And I think that the original Avengers represents that. I think the original Avengers represent the idea of people coming together, a superhero team coming together, and that togetherness is always good and that it goes smoothly. And I think Thunderbolt, so that's, I would call Avengers from about 2012 to 2019, this kind of age of optimism. Okay. So, and then I think after that, so COVID hits, people get sent to their homes. People are like, people become very disillusioned in the years between 2012 or the first Avengers movie and even 2018, 19, whatever, especially now, people become very disillusioned with social media and online dating. And so the idea of a main character, so essentially when Bob turns into Void, which he does that when picking up on the story part of my little narrative. So the Thunderbolts are at Avengers Tower, which symbolizes them confronting the memory of this great superhero team that they can't at all measure up to, right? So they're there to confront Julia Louis-Dreyfus's character, Valentina, who's controlling Bob, and Bob throws off the shackles and he becomes the villain. And that sets that part of the story into motion. This is the traditional superhero part. So Bob, as Void, the super soldier, who's more powerful than anyone there, including Bucky, begins to turn people into mist. And Yelena has a breakdown that I just read of her life not really having meaning. And she sits on the phone after work. And so Alexei, her father, Red Guardian, gives her a great motivational speech and says that they can get together and do it. And so that was really great. He says, we all have things we regret, and she has so many. You know, she had to off another child basically in this horrible, dark past of working at, like, with Red Room, this assassin group, right? So Yelena, and that's another thing in this movie, is there's so much trauma. So Bucky Barnes had trauma. He was brainwashed as a Winter Soldier. Yelena has trauma. She's forced to end another child's life as this kind of Black Widow character. Alexei has trauma. He was Red Guardian and then lost it all. It was no longer this sort of Russian Superman, Captain America character. That was all dashed in the memory. And so these characters just don't have anything going for them. It's very dark. It's like you have lost it all. And so that's another element that doesn't really fit into typical Marvel. And so basically that speech marks the turning point where the team gets to really focuses and works together. And it kind of enters this next part of the movie. So Yelena confronts Bob as this evil character Void that he is now, and she goes into the dark mist that he's projecting. And so it's feared by other characters she's going to die. And when she doesn't, she enters into Bob's mind. And so this is very symbolic, like afraid of engaging someone else. So when you engage someone else that you don't know, you always run the risk of them being too much, of them being a bad fit for you. The option, the alternative is that you actually just don't do anything, that you pull back and you stay alone. That's an option a lot of people take, unfortunately, is they have bad interactions, they quarantine themselves off, they write about how bad other people are. And I think, so here's my analysis. I'm trying to do it concurrently with going through the movie. So up to this point, we've seen imperfect people in the form of the Thunderbolts banding together and breaking through their mistrust. okay, and deciding that they're going to fight a person who is manipulating someone else who escaped with them, okay, namely Bob. Okay, so so Bob, his trauma was manipulated. He was used as this sort of makeshift Captain America. He was bashed into this form that he didn't really want. And so these characters then, after Yelena walks in the shadows, other characters walk in with her, and they come out almost like a black hole. They walk into this mist and come out in Bob's mind, witnessing him hiding in an attic from his parents fighting. And so they join up with him and say, okay, Bob, you can beat this force that's taking you over. So this is very powerful because it represents people saying, I'm going to cut through misunderstandings on text, or I'm going to cut through momentary discomfort. I'm going to sit with someone. And so this movie represents not only overcoming the fear of talking to people or being around anyone, it represents the ability to listen and to actually imagine another person's interior world, their intersubjectivity, their internal world. It's very powerful. And so the characters, here's the ultimate spoiler. So if you really don't want to know how the movie ends, you can turn away now. But essentially, the movie becomes a trauma reprocessing film, which I love as a therapist, obviously. So Bucky, Bob, Yelena, who have been through so much in their own trauma and have all seen. So Bob is a abuse, physical abuse, child abuse survivor. Bucky was brainwashed and forced to unalive people and off them, and Yelena was assassinated from childhood. So when Bucky and Yelena and then Red Guardian and Ghost enter Bob's mind to help him through his own replaying of trauma, it's very therapeutic for all of them, because what they're saying is the past is in the past and it's time to get out of it. And so the Thunderbolts is actually a movie about overcoming your trauma to go forward. And so, of course, as you know, in a superhero movie, they've emerged victorious. Now, what's fascinating is it's an ego state movie too, because the void is a manifestation of Bob's internal darkness. And this is where everybody can relate to it. So when you have a character like Bob, he's very passive and demure and afraid because he's been literally beaten into submission his whole life, and he's like in his maybe 20s or 30 in the movie, I don't know which. But there's usually deep darkness behind that and anger from being abused that way. And so in this movie, it's obviously represented as a superpowered element where he gets his most power and his ability to do horrible things is through his anger, but he's out of control. So Void is this manifestation of his worst self that takes over. And inside his mind is his good self that's no longer active. And so the characters are in his mind, helping him fight the darkness. And then they all come out and they undo it. And the people that were dematerialized or the mist come back, right? So the day is saved through helping through trauma survivors coming through another person's mind, listening to them, being unafraid to say, it's okay, we're going to get through this and we don't have to keep reliving trauma, and freeing that other person. So what is that? That's like group therapy, right? It truly is. And so after that, the movie winds up, and the psychopathic government character is told that she's owned by the Thunderbolts, because what happens is right as they're about to apprehend her, they literally walk through an area to arrest Valentina, and this is very surreal almost. It's a press conference, and she introduces the Thunderbolts as the new Avengers, which is interesting. I loved that. I loved that reveal, because I think they are the new Avengers. I think the new Avengers represent teaming up with your allies, with imperfect people, and rising above screens, rising above misunderstandings, even rising above past negative interactions with people, and instead saying, look, we're going to do something great, in spite of the fact that technology and togetherness has actually resulted in more mistrust and massive amounts of manipulation and harm than ever before, on a wider scale, because you're exposed to more people. And I almost think you could say that, if you want to get really analytical with it, that the Thunderbolts represent average technology users, and Valentina represents any kind of marketing or media platform, because you could say, well, when I band together with my in-person allies and colleagues who are imperfect, I'm going to use technology any way I want, and I own it. And none of this I'm going to use marketing, and I'm going to use getting my voice out there and my message for good out there as a force of good. And going to allow myself to be manipulated and marketed to as a product, treated like a product, having my insecurity or my innate narcissism amplified into a form that makes me fight other people, because social media is player versus player. Online dating is player versus player. So you're out there fighting other people and trying to win the game, and you're being sorted by algorithms. And so it is very much like how Valentina manipulates the anti-heroes at the beginning of the movie to off each other, and they decide, no, I'm going to team up. And instead, we're going to find out what's true, and we're going to actually rescue someone else who's been caught in this web of deception, who essentially became addicted to substances after childhood trauma and wanted a super soldier serum and fell into Valentina's trials and became hyper manipulated and brainwashed. And so it's not lost on me that characters who were already caught in a web of deception were redeemed through helping another person who was even more lost. And so I don't think there's any better metaphor than those people being trapped in some kind of a technological postmodern web like social media or online dating users, coming out of it and saying, okay, let's all help each other. Let's all ally and be with each other as imperfect people. And let's overcome our trauma and not trauma dump, but survive it together. And if one person needs more help one day, that's okay. So again, I think the most powerful imagery in the movie is entering into Bob's psyche. And again, so to portray that, it's beyond put down the damn phone, and it gets into, I'm entering your mind as you experience your emotions. So it goes from being completely disconnected and a poor listener to, I'm actually going to listen so well to you as another person that I'm going to know what it's like in your mind. And so if you think I'm being really zealous or overzealous about this, you're right, because I haven't seen a Marvel movie that's been that relatable or interesting in years. I don't think most people relate to Steve Rogers as Captain America. I don't think most people relate to a lot of the characters in the Marvel pantheon of superhero lowercase g gods. I think what they would relate to is people who feel that they've been misunderstood and started out with good intentions, like John Walker, the Captain America who becomes U.S. agent and his own thing after he falters in being Captain America due to his temper. So, okay, Yelena, who was basically a Black Widow character and whose nervous system's hypervigilant, like being completely unable to overcome her trauma and trying to dull it with her phone and with putting her nose to grindstone, her head in her work. A lot of people are going to relate to that. These are people who didn't have great pasts, and instead they build a rocky present of tentative trust, and then they go into a better future. And so by the end of the movie, it jumps a bit in time, and they are the new Avengers. And Sam Wilson, the current Captain America, is portrayed as actually suing them for the name, which I think is really wild. They're setting it up where the new Avengers and Sam Wilson, if he's getting another team together of people as the Avengers, are clashing. And then that's unfortunate, because I think the new Avengers are a pretty cool team. And the movie ends there with the suspense of what's going to happen next. And I'm excited for it. I don't know what's going to happen next. What's interesting is Bob is revealed as being powerless when he's not angry or the void, which I think hopefully they do something with that. That's very similar to how the Hulk's power is anger. And so again, this is very postmodern. The Hulk represents this entity whose anger charges his physical transformation, and then Void, or aka Bob, is this character whose inner trauma, whose domestic abuse from his father basically powers this evil. And so it's like, well, actually, we're going to make the Hulk, but we're going to make it more sad. We're going to say there's a character whose ability to do anything superpowered is extremely violent. It could be basically a nuclear bomb, and it comes from this sort of horrific trauma. And so I think just, it's not spoiler if it's just me conjecturing, I guess, but I'm going to guess that Bob finds some way to work through the pain of the trauma, and that he can activate his powers another way, or through anger. Like, if you could think of Magneto, right? He's another character. He survived the Holocaust, and he could only get his power going initially through anger, and then Charles Xavier, Professor X, helps Magneto to do it through other emotion. Like, that's another, like, those tragic superheroes who have their power connected to extreme negative emotion. I think that's relatable, because most people only set boundaries when they are angry, or when they have a and they are there when they feel most alive is when they're most angry or threatened. And I think that actually gets into much of the Thunderbolts. Oh, this is a good parallel. So you've got these characters like Yelena or Bucky who jump into action when others are threatened and they have these massive abilities to harness their reflexes. And for Yelena, it's for personal gain. And so the movie says, okay, well, so I'm going to reflect this back to you. And so here's a character who's nothing but ultimate reflexes and physical power triggered by darkness. And here's a lampooning. Here's the mirror of yourself, Thunderbolt, aka New Avengers. You are power catalyzed by darkness. That's what you are. Do you want to stay that? Because here's what you'll be. You'll be a zombie who turns others into mist and vapor. So, I mean, the richness of the narrative is unbelievable. And I wouldn't be talking about another movie like this. I'm not going to name any names, but there's some films that are just not great when it comes to the superhero genre. I certainly don't think this one fits into that mold. I think people are going to be revisiting this one for quite a while as a tale of trauma redemption and of gathering with your imperfect allies, right? And not defecting into that negative option of the prisoner's dilemma where everyone digs in their heels, but instead trusting and winning. And so I hope this has been helpful.